Amnesia, Rebirth. Chapter 1, A Dream of Algeria. The sun scorched the endless dunes, its harsh light glinting off the red Saharan sands. Tasi Trianon shielded her eyes as she trudged forward, compelled by some nameless force to keep walking though her body begged to stop. She had no food, no water, no shelter from the merciless heat. Only an endless ocean of sand and stone baking beneath the fiery sun. Tasi's throat burned, her lips cracked and bleeding. Strange visions swam before her weary eyes, a lone vulture circling high above, the bleached bones of a camel half buried in the shifting dunes. Her son, standing atop a high dune, waving and calling to her before turning and vanishing over the crest. No, wait. Tasi tried to call out, but only a ragged croak emerged from her raw throat. She pushed her aching body faster, staggering up the slope where she'd seen the fleeting image of her son. But there was nothing. Only the desolate landscape extending endlessly in all directions beneath the crushing blue sky. The sight wrenched a low moan from deep within Tasi's chest. She collapsed to her knees, body racked with dry, heaving sobs. It couldn't end like this, alone and forgotten in this endless desert limbo. There had to be something more. Some path back to the life she'd lost. The world around her began to darken, the blinding sunlight fading. A cold shadow passed over Tasi, filling her with sudden dread. She raised her head and saw an enormous fortress rising from the sands like a great stone mausoleum. Cracked walls towered high over her, blotting out the sun. Dark windows gaped empty, the yawning entryway gaping wide like a mouth ready to swallow her whole. From deep within echoed the distant sounds of screams and moans, as if the earth itself were crying out in pain. Tasi awoke with a gasp, her heart racing. She sat up in the small berth of the passenger plane, orienting herself once more to reality. The disturbing dream of the desert already began receding from her mind, like the tides going out, leaving only an uneasy feeling in its wake. She took a few deep breaths, steadying her heartbeat. It was just the jet lag and nerves getting to her. The flight to Algeria was taking its toll. She was anxious about this expedition with her husband to the remote desert outpost, even if she couldn't fully place why. The desert had always unsettled Tasi, and now they journeyed toward its farthest reaches, chasing rumors and legends of a forgotten fortress called the Cradle of Sins. She hoped this trip might rekindle their strained relationship after the tragedy they'd endured. But the further the plane took them into that arid no-man's land, the more Tasi's unease grew. She glanced to the seat beside her where her husband Salim lay sleeping, envy pricking at his untroubled rest. She reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from his face, heart aching. Once this trip was behind them, perhaps they could finally begin reconciling all they'd lost. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jostling in the air currents. Tasi peered out the window where the pre-dawn sky was fading to gold at the horizon's edge. She watched the growing dawn nervously, unable to escape the feeling they flew straight into the maw of some nameless danger. And there would be no coming back from it. Chapter 2, Dawn over the desert. The plane droned on through the early morning sky. Out the window, the night's darkness gradually gave way to the pastel glow of dawn spreading across the distant dunes. Tasi leaned against the side of the rattling fuselage, watching the sleeping landscape emerge into the new light. She hadn't been able to fall back asleep after her troubling dream. Its details were already fading, but an uneasy feeling still clung to her like the desert sand drumming faintly against the hull. Salim stirred in the seat next to hers. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes and giving her a drowsy smile. "Good morning, my darling, you're up early." Tasi tried to return the smile. "Morning, I couldn't really sleep." Salim took her hand, concern in his dark eyes. "The dream again?" She nodded, then shook herself as if to cast off the grim mood. "It's silly, just nerves about this trip, I'm sure." He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Outside, the growing dawn turned the star-speckled sky a radiant orange. The flat horizon emerged from the receding night, revealing an expanse of sweeping dunes and jutting mesas. They were well into the deep desert now. "We'll be there soon," Salim said gently. "Once we've found this old fortress, and you have the adventure you've always dreamed of, this unease will fade." Tasi nodded, trying to share his optimism. Since losing the young son the year before, their world had been steeped in grief. This expedition to the ruins of a mysterious desert outpost was meant to be a new beginning. She was an archaeologist, after all. The mysteries and adventures were her lifeblood. How could a place teeming with history and intrigue not ignite her old passion? Yet as the small prop plane carried them over the lifeless landscape, she felt nothing but a growing dread. Perhaps it was just this endless expanse of barren wilderness passing below. Its ancient stillness unsettled her, as if unknown eyes watched them intruding on a land better left undisturbed. The dread lingered as morning brightened over the desert. The pilot announced their descent soon to a small landing strip near the excavation camp. Tasi tried to shake off her foreboding and focus on what lay ahead. With luck, the adventure would help mend their grieving souls. Yet she couldn't escape the feeling that this cursed wasteland held only loss and death. That they never should have come. The plane dropped lower, its shadow racing over the dunes. Ruins began materializing on the horizon, and beside them a small cluster of expedition tents. Tasi swallowed hard. There could be no turning back now. The desert awaited. Chapter 3: Ominous Omens. The expedition plane droned ever onward through the morning sky. The initial excitement Tasi had felt back in Cairo faded, replaced by a growing unease. Salim kept glancing her way, worry etched on his handsome features. He tried to engage her in idle chatter about the ruins ahead, but Tasi found herself lost in troubled thought. She couldn't pinpoint the source of her melancholy, only that the further they flew into the remote wastes, the heavier her spirit grew. Outside the window, the desert sprawled endlessly beneath the droning engines. Seen from above, the dunes and rock formations almost resembled a sea frozen mid-tide. Shadows still pooled between the swells and ridges as the morning sun continued its ascent. The landscape looked cold somehow. Lifeless. Entirely inhospitable to humans. Yet men like Salim still braved the wastes, driven by grit, ambition, and legends of forgotten riches. One such legend had inspired this expedition, Tasi reluctantly reminded herself. Out here past the sand seas lay the ruins of a mysterious fortress called the Cradle. Early surveys hinted at a wealth of artifacts and history buried below the shifting sands. Yet each expedition to excavate the site had ended prematurely and violently, according to the rumors. Men had fled or vanished. Equipment was destroyed in strange mishaps. Some blamed the nomad tribes, while others whispered of a deeper curse that shrouded the ruins, as if something there did not wish to be disturbed. Tasi shivered as the plane hit another pocket of turbulence. Gazing down at the lifeless landscape, she could almost believe some malevolent force guarded this place. The land itself seemed to reject the intrusion of outsiders. She thought of her chilling dream. Had it been an omen of dangers that lay ahead? A warning they were all in over their heads? "Look," Solemn said suddenly, breaking her bleak reverie. He pointed out the window with boyish excitement. "There in the valley, ibex." Cassie followed his gaze. Sure enough, a small herd of ibex picked their way over the rocky terrain, tan coats blending with the desert. Despite her mood, she smiled. Their guide was right. Adventure did still kindle her spirit. She felt that old thrill of discovery taking root as she imagined roving over ancient history buried beneath the sands. This land may seem cursed and dangerous, but with Salim at her side, they would unravel its secrets. She took his hand, rekindling her courage. Perhaps she would finally lay her grief to rest in the desert silence and emerge renewed. They would survive this place of desolation. Even as Tasi reassured herself, a flicker of shadow passed over the window. She glanced up, suppressing a gasp. A huge vulture soared past, massive wingspan blacking out the morning sun. As its shadow fell across her face, a chill ran through her body. It was the vulture from her dream, she was certain of it. Watching. Waiting. An ill omen of death over the desert sands. The plane leveled out as the engines droned north towards their mysterious destination. But the brief hope Tasi had kindled quickly guttered out. All that remained was a cold, creeping dread of what lay ahead. Chapter 4. Turbulence. The expedition plane droned ever onward through the brightening desert sky. The landscape remained still and silent beneath them, devoid of life or movement save for the occasional herd of ibex picking their way over rock and dune. Tasi leaned against the vibrating hull, gaze fixed out the window, though she scarcely saw the passing terrain. Her thoughts turned endlessly back to her troubling dreams, and the growing conviction that they never should have come to this place. Beside her, Salim dozed once again despite the loud engines. Tasi envied his ability to sleep, a respite her own swirling mind denied her. She checked her watch, nearly noon, still hours to go before reaching their destination. The pilot had radioed earlier that morning of strange storms further north delaying their approach. Were the legends true? Tasi mused grimly. Did some vengeful spirit guard this cursed place, stirring the very winds against them? She shook her head, annoyed at her own fancies. Sandstorms were common in the desert. She needn't ascribe supernatural causes. This was an archaeological expedition, not some haunted house. Yet she couldn't fully silence the doubts that twisted within. Time crawled by in the cramped, noisy cabin. Tasi passed the hours studying maps of the excavation site and surrounding region. The Cradle of Sins appeared a modest complex compared to the sprawling tombs and temples of pharaohs further south, but the utter isolation intrigued her. Legends spoke of an entire community once thriving at this desert oasis before some unknown disaster wiped them out, leaving only these ominous blood-hued ruins. What dark secrets might still linger beneath the sands, waiting to be unearthed? The plane jolted suddenly, jarring Tasi from her thoughts. Salim jerked awake beside her as turbulence rattled the small craft. Tasi gripped the armrests, knuckles white. The sea of dunes outside tilted at a crazy angle, the horizon skewing wildly as the plane fought to stabilize. Her heart hammered an erratic beat in her throat. Just as the craft leveled out, the engines sputtered and whined in protest. A burning smell seeped into the cabin. The pilot's garbled voice crackled over the radio, barely audible over the noise. Blasted sandstorm. Localized cell. Coming in fast. The world seemed to lurch sickeningly. Luggage spilled from the overhead bins as the plane plunged and balked like an unbroken camel. Tasi tasted bile, fighting down her nausea. Salim grabbed her hand, face pale beneath his stubble. "Be calm, Tasi. It will pass." He tried reassuring her above the din. She clutched his hand, the cabin dissolving into a cacophony of alarms, shouts, and staccato bursts from the straining engines. The plane was in real trouble. Cassie peered out into the roiling clouds of sand now enveloping them. She saw something within the maelstrom, a fleeting image that turned her blood to ice. Two baleful points of crimson light, blinking in and out amidst the storm. Eyes, she was certain of it. Ancient, inhuman eyes, filled with malevolence. Watching them. The sand swallowed the lights as the plane groaned in its death throes. They were going down. The desert had claimed them after all. Chapter 5. Crash. Chaos engulfed the small plane as it plunged through the sandstorm. The cabin rattled violently, loose items crashing around the terrified passengers. Cassie braced herself against the seat as the aircraft nosed into a sharp dive. Salim gripped her shoulder, shouting assurances she could barely hear over the screaming winds and sputtering engines. It did little to calm her pounding heart. The groaning plane leveled briefly, wings shuddering. The pilot was fighting to regain control, banking hard against the battering gusts. For a few desperate moments, Tasi allowed herself to hope they would break free of the worst turbulence. Then the right engine burst into flames, metal shrieking as a wing crumpled. Any fleeting hope vanished. The crippled plane spiraled downward through the obscuring sands. The pilot's frantic voice crackled one last time over the radio, brace for impact, before fading into oblivion. Cassie swallowed a scream, breaths coming rapid and shallow. She fumbled to fasten her seatbelt with trembling hands. Beside her, Salim recited verses from the Quran, face clenched as if in prayer. Perhaps finding last rites for his immortal soul as their velocity spiked, plummeting faster and faster towards the barren earth so very far below. Cassie closed her eyes, tears leaking down her cheeks. She should have trusted her instincts, her dreams. This place was cursed, and now they would perish here, swallowed by the ancient desert that brooked no trespassers. She thought of her poor son, hopefully waiting beyond the veil of life, if such comforts existed. She would see him again soon. A bone-jarring impact cut short her thoughts. The sensation of falling ceased, replaced by an explosion of screeching metal and shattering glass. A nightmarish cacophony of destruction that battered her senses until the blooming darkness took her. When awareness returned, Tasi found herself crumpled awkwardly in her seat, held fast by the belt. Blood trickled into her eyes, the cabin spinning sickeningly. She tried turning her head, only for the pain to spike hot needles through her brain. She nearly blacked out again. "Salim?" she managed weakly. There was no response. Through the ringing in her ears came only the rending groans of metal and the distant whisper of wind-driven sand. The plane had gone down, and Tasi was utterly alone. Panic seized her, lending strength enough to twist round, seeking her husband. Salim lay limply against his restraints, eyes closed and face deathly pale. Dark blood matted his hair near the temple. Fighting nausea, Tasi fumbled with his seat belt until it released him into her arms. She shook his shoulder gently. "Salim, please wake up." Her voice was barely a ragged whisper. He didn't stir. Tasi pressed trembling fingers against his neck, dizzy with relief at the steady pulse there. Only unconscious then. She took a few steadying breaths before taking stock of their situation. The front half of the plane had crumpled like a ball of discarded paper, the cockpit shattered on impact. A wall of flaming debris separated them from the unseen fate of their pilot. Icy dread trickled down her spine. No one could have survived that inferno. She and Salim alone had miraculously been spared instant death. Cradling her husband close, Tasi strained to see through cracked windows for any sign of other survivors. But the sandstorm still obscured everything beyond a few feet. They were well and truly alone, two souls clinging to life in the wreckage of their aircraft, stranded in the endless wastes. Tasi shuddered, grief and hopelessness competing with her indomitable will to survive. She could not give up now. Gritting her teeth against the pain, she undid Salim's belt than her own. She had to get them out, find shelter. With agonizing care, she shifted Salim toward the fractured emergency exit, winding her scarf over his head wound. The harsh sand-laden wind whipped through the cabin as she kicked the door open and crawled out, dragging Salim with her. Standing proved impossible. Her left leg buckled sharply in protest. Grimacing, Tasi pulled them both across the scorched sand away from the fiery ruins and huddled low. She had no supplies, no weapon, and no idea if her husband would ever wake. But she was alive. They both still drew breath. And so long as hope remained, she would not surrender them to this endless desert. Gazing out at the roiling storm, Tasi steeled her resolve. They would survive this. Somehow. Chapter 6. The Wreckage. A harsh scraping sound invaded the void, dragging Tasi back from the brink of oblivion. She cracked open crusted eyes, disoriented. Blinding sunlight pierced through the swirling grit, searing her pounded skull. She squinted against the glare, trying to focus. The sandstorm had passed, leaving an eerie calm. As awareness crept in, so did the pain. In her legs, her chest, her head that felt close to splitting open. She groaned, the sound scraping raw from her parched throat. How long had she been unconscious? Memory crept back in jagged pieces. The flight, the storm. Tasi turned her head slowly, fresh stabs of pain flashing behind her eyes. The mangled fuselage loomed nearby, a tomb of metal and flame. Debris jutted at unnatural angles from the ruined shell, the broken tail sweeping up like a metallic spine. A plume of oily smoke still coiled from the ravaged cockpit. There would be no help from that quarter. With agonizing effort, Tasi shifted onto her back, biting back a scream as the movement jarred her broken body. Gritting her teeth, she searched for Salim. He lay a few feet away, coated in dust and blood, but breathing steadily. At least fate had not yet torn them fully asunder. Marshalling her strength, Tasi sat up despite every cell in her body crying out in protest. She had to take stock, determine their chances. Their gear was strewn in wreckage across the crash site. Tasi crawled like a wounded animal, dragging her lame leg through the scattered contents of the cargo hold. With shaking hands, she retrieved 2 canteens that had survived intact. The water was tepid, but tasted sweeter than the finest wine as it soothed her ragged throat. She brought the second canteen to Salim, cradling his head as she trickled a small measure between his lips. He coughed, eyes fluttering without waking, but it was enough to sustain him. Tasi continued searching, collecting a rucksack, knife, fire-starting kit, garments for shade, and their maps. The provisions were meager, but enough for basic survival. For now. Her body pleaded for rest, but she refused to yield. Judging by the sun, they still had a few intense hours of daylight, time she dare not waste. Once night's chill set in, their situation would turn lethal. Biting back agony with each movement, Tasi dragged the makeshift camp away from the smoldering crash. She arranged debris into a crude windbreak and assembled the critical supplies. A basic fire took shape after several failed attempts with the kit. Soon a small blaze crackled, dispelling the evening's growing chill. As the sun sank below the distant dunes, Tasi finally allowed herself to collapse beside it, utterly spent. She took Salim's hand in her filthy, bloodied fingers. "I will get us out of this desert, my love," she whispered. "I swear it." He gave no response, but she had not given up hope. When dawn came, they would begin the long trek to survival. Together. The night closed in around their lonely camp, the crash a mere shadow on the horizon. Above them spread infinity, endless stars over endless sands. Tasi hunched wearily by the small fire as night deepened over the desert. The temperature plummeted with the sun's departure, even the meager flames offering little reprieve. She shivered uncontrollably, her body racked by pain both physical and mental. Though she had survived the crash, this was merely the start of their ordeal. Without help, the coming days would prove far more deadly. Gazing out into the yawning blackness, Tasi felt insignificant, adrift in the vast, uncaring waste. What hope could two broken souls have in this abyss? Despair threatened to crush what little fortitude remained. She looked to Salim lying beside her, swaddled in garments for warmth. At least he still drew breath, though he had not fully woken since the crash. The cruel desert would surely claim them both in time. But if they must die in this forsaken place, she wanted Salim to know he did not suffer alone. "I'm still here, my love," she whispered through cracked lips. "We will make it through this night and greet the dawn together once more." She gently brushed sand from his face. He had not abandoned hope after their son's death as she nearly had. Salim's resilient spirit was her beacon now in this darkness. The night wore on interminable. The coffee can of water boiled over the fire provided some relief, but Tasi's despair grew. Her broken leg rendered walking near impossible. How could she get them to safety? She stared into the frail flames, as if demanding they reveal some means of salvation. But there were no answers in the wavering tons of fire. Only the void of sky above, infinite and indifferent. When exhaustion finally claimed her, Tasi's dreams returned swirling images of the crash, interspersed with visions of her dead son reaching out across a gulf she could not breach. But somewhere in the tumult, she glimpsed the 2 points of crimson light from the storm, flashing malevolently. Tasi jerked awake with a strangled cry. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. Dawn's first pale rays etched the horizon. She shook off the haunting dreams. The answers she sought lay not in fitful slumber or imaginings, but in the sole direction offering any hope, the distant ruins shimmering hazily northward. The cradle still called, its message now unmistakable. Their salvation waited within those blood-stained walls. Grimacing against the pain, Tasi wrapped cloth around her leg in a makeshift brace. She would walk, crawl, drag them both if needed to reach the ancient fortress. They would endure. There was simply no other choice. With newfound resolve, she stirred the fire's embers, waking Salim as gently as she could. Together they watched the rising sun banish night's terrors, at least for a few precious hours. When the light had strengthened sufficiently, Tasi helped Salim take small sips of water. His dark eyes finally fluttered open, staring up at her in confusion. "Tasi," he asked weakly, "what happened?" Despite everything, she smiled with profound relief. "There was a crash, my love, but do not worry, we are alive, and I believe help awaits us there." She gestured towards the beckoning ruins, standing resolute against the dawn sky. Salim followed her gaze and gave the slightest nod. With agonizing effort, they helped each other up. Arm in arm, the two broken figures began their desperate trek towards the promise of salvation shimmering across the sands. Chapter 7. Shadows in the Sand. The sun beat down mercilessly as Tasi and Salim trekked across the desert. Distance distorted in the shimmering heat so that the horizon ruins barely seemed to draw nearer despite hours of painful walking. When the ordeal grew too much, they rested in what meager shade Tasi could improvise from their garments. Neither complained nor commented on the desperateness of their plight. Conserving energy and morale took precedence. Still, as the day wore on and the fortress remained stubbornly distant, Tasi felt her spirits flagging. The makeshift brace helped steady her broken leg, but each step still shot bolts of pure agony through her body. She bit down hard to keep from crying out. Salim leaned heavily against her side, drifting in and out of coherence. It was all she could do to keep them both upright and moving forward, one labored step after another. Mirages began to flicker at the edges of her vision, cool blue pools and swaying palms promising refuge, though Tasi knew them to be illusion. But other visions disturbed her, dark shadows flitting across the dunes when she glanced away. Half-formed silhouettes that vanished when she tried to focus. Were they real, or merely her heat-addled mind playing tricks? She did not share the sightings with Salim, afraid of fracturing his tenuous composure. By late afternoon, Tasi guessed they had covered 5 or 6 miles at most. The crashed plane remained visible as a dark smudge on the southern horizon. Cresting a dune, she scanned the unchanging landscape for some sign of their progress. There, perhaps another mile north, she spotted a lone speck breaking the barren monotony. A desert shrub clinging to life against the odds. They were still far from the ancient walls, but this minor landmark heartened her nonetheless. "See that, Salim?" she said, pointing. "We'll rest in its shade before continuing on." He grunted acknowledgement, head bowed with fatigue. Tasi took his arm and together they made their way down into the swale. Trudging the last stretch to the shrub took every ounce of effort she could muster. But after what felt an eternity, they huddled finally in its scant shadow. Tasi allowed a few small sips from the canteen before passing it to Salim. As he drank, she studied the sturdy branches and thick gnarled trunk. In better times, she would have paused to admire its tenacity flourishing alone in such an inhospitable clime. A kindred spirit. She opened her mouth to comment, but the words died in her throat. There, carved into the weathered trunk, the roughly etched shape of a small boy. Unmistakable. Tasi recoiled with a hiss. It was him, her son. Carved here, where no human had set foot for millennia. Hallucination or cruel jest, she sank to her knees with a choked sob. "Tasi!" Salim's shout cut through her turmoil. She followed his outstretched hand. There, cresting a dune no more than 100 yards north, stood the silhouette of their son, watching impassively for one heartbeat, two, then vanishing over the ridge. Tasi shook her head fiercely, denying the vision. But Salim had seen him too. They clung to each other, bodies racked with gasping cries for the child they had lost. Their small son come to guide them out of this wasteland or condemn them. When their weeping subsided, resolve hardened in Tasi anew. These visions were a test, she told herself. Illusions sent by the desert to break them. She would not surrender to madness. Grasping Salim's hand, she pulled them forward. They had tarried too long. As they marched on, Tasi glimpsed their son's silhouette several more times cresting dunes ahead. She quickened their pace, refusing to lose sight of him. Real or phantom, he led them north toward those cursed ruins. Their last chance of escape from this endless graveyard. They would follow. Chapter 8. The Deserted Outpost. Night descended swiftly upon the desert. Tasi struggled to keep sight of her son's distant silhouette in the deepening gloom. Part mirage, part tortured memory, he remained their guide over ridges and through meandering dry creek beds. Salim stumbled along beside her, coherent at times, drifting at others. She doubted he registered their spectral escort. As the cold night closed in, Tasi despaired they would collapse from exposure. Just when she thought their ordeal could stretch no further, their phantom guide crested a final dune and vanished. With the last of their strength, Tasi and Salim staggered to the summit and beheld an outpost nestled in the valley below. A handful of crumbling structures comprised the abandoned camp, an ancient stone well, a partially collapsed dwelling, and most welcoming of all, walls to shelter them from the biting wind. Tasi wanted to weep at the sight. Their son had led them to salvation. With renewed vigor, she quickened their pace, half dragging Salim along the sandy slope toward the decrepit buildings. The well's roof had long since vanished, but a moisture-darkened lower lip showed the water source had not fully succumbed to the ages. Tasi sent up a small prayer of thanks to whatever powers led them here. They took refuge in the most intact structure, blocking the open doorway with debris to keep out the wind. Tasi settled Salim against a wall before allowing herself to collapse in exhaustion. Every inch of her body howled in protest, but the relief at finding shelter outstripped even the pain. By the moon's one light filtering in, she inspected their rocky sanctuary. Little remained of its original function. A random debris littered the packed dirt floor, and a few cloth fragments clinging to the far wall. Ancient shards of pottery crunched under her boots. But more ominously, dark splotches marred the stone, unmistakable dried blood. This place had seen violence once, long ago. The phantom guide had not led them astray after all. Though unease pricked at her, exhaustion overruled any misgivings. They desperately needed rest. She nestled close to Salim for warmth and allowed her heavy eyelids to close, trusting their spectral guarding to alert her to any danger. When she woke, it was dawn, the outpost a hive of activity. Robed men hurried to and fro bearing overflowing baskets and water jugs, drinking deep from the well. Smoke rose from a cook fire by the doorway, carrying scents of meat and spice. Tasi blinked in confusion. Had they been saved? But no one seemed to notice her or Salim's presence. Then she spied the boy, weaving nimbly through the bustle, face obscured beneath his headscarf. Tasi shouted to him, but he did not turn. Was this another mirage? Some glimpse into the outpost's days of prosperity long turned to dust. She watched the spectral ritual unfold, the sharing of water and food, the daily maintenance of an isolated but thriving desert community. Her son's silhouette flitted between the shadows of the past, at once there and not there, an outsider to his own vision. When the boy exited through the doorway, Tasi managed to stand and stagger after him, heedless of those around her. She had to know where he went each day, why he haunted yet shunned them. She tripped on the threshold onto open sand, baked in the familiar sun. The outpost was again a desolate ruin. Tasi fell to her knees, bereft. Was there no end to these torturous visions? A firm hand grasped her shoulder, solemn, gazing at her in grave concern. She wept into his chest until the sobs subsided. "Ghosts from the past, that's all they were," she whispered finally. Solemn nodded, though his eyes betrayed lingering doubt. As the day brightened, they explored the derelict outpost, recovering some relics from its days of life. More foreboding bloodstains marked the dwelling interiors. When Tasi peered into the deep well, she saw only darkness, the water table long receded from human reach. They filled the canteens frugally from their dwindling store and rested in preparation for the day's journey. Questions festered in Tassi's mind, but she did not voice them. Whatever tragedy had befallen this outpost, its long-dead residents had helped theirs live another day. That was enough. As they departed north at dusk, Tasi whispered a small prayer of thanks to their nameless spectral guardians. Another cold night awaited, but the lights of the distant fortress beckoned brighter. Chapter 9. Caravan of Bones. The abandoned outpost faded into shadow as Tasi and Salim stumbled north through the frigid night. Though bone-weary, Tasi did not dare stop to rest. The day's bizarre visions haunted her, whispering that madness waited eagerly to claim any who lingered too long in this wasteland. Their only hope was to keep the fortress ruins in sight and let its solid walls anchor them in the present. No easy task in the dark where reality blurred treacherously. They had survived 2 nights since the crash. But Tasi knew in her heart that, without shelter, another exposure to the icy desert night would be their last. The fortress had to provide refuge or death awaited with the rising sun. So she pushed them on through the darkness, one agonizing step after another, keeping that distant beacon fixed in sight. Salam did not speak, conserving his energy for the ordeal. He clung to her, shivering violently, as much from the hauntings as the cold. They both sensed the phantoms observing them, flitting just out of sight. For now the presences seemed content to merely escort the living trespassers, not yet fully intervene. But their intentions remained unfathomable. To distract her fraying mind, Tasi recounted legends of the cradle she had researched before the doomed flight. Some tales spoke of it as an oasis citadel built long ago in the empty wastes, its inhabitants creating a desert paradise through ingenuity. Others said it was erected atop some power-imbued site by ancient sorcerers as a monument to their occult knowledge. All agreed its prosperity was short-lived. Perhaps her own visions in the outpost echoed the cradle's final living days before calamity ended them. So engrossed was she in the macabre tales, Tasi failed to spot the hulking shadow on the horizon until nearly stumbling into its bulk. She halted abruptly, heart seizing. Beside her, Salim gasped through cracked lips. Looming from the darkness rose the skeletal remains of a gigantic, decayed animal. Gnarled ribs jutted at grotesque angles toward the stars, enormous jawbones gaping in a silent howl. The bones had been picked clean by ages of scouring wind and sand. Despite the massive carcass' desiccated state, a lingering stench of decay hit their nostrils. Death still clung to its ancient flagship, Cassie lowered the scarf from her mouth, bile rising in her throat. By the towering leg bones, this leviathan could only be a camel, but of appalling proportions. Almost certainly, it was a pack beast from one of the lost caravans rumored to litter the deep desert. Most never found their way out once the fortress trails were abandoned. She took Salim's trembling hand in her own. How desperate must that lost party have been, trying to traverse such waste? There could be only one outcome. Their ambling bones were likely scattered across the dunes now in testament. They gave the colossal cadaver a wide berth. As they skirted its shadow, Tasi glimpsed shapes darting between the gigantic ribs. Figures that skittered and hunched, indistinct as heat ripples. She blinked, and they vanished. But when she glanced back over her shoulder, she was certain more spirits clustered around the fallen titan. Wordlessly, they fled into the night, not daring to look back again. The last, most perilous stretch of desert stretched ahead before sanctuary rose in sight. Tasi whispered a small prayer that her eyes might not glimpse what other remnants lay scattered across the sands beneath the indifferent moon. Some truths were too terrible to bear. The fortress walls drew tantalizingly closer over the endless night. No visions dared haunt them directly again, though Tasi sensed phantom shapes lurking just out of sight. She pressed onward ruthlessly. Whatever awaited them within those blood-stained halls, it must be better than the horrors without. As dawn's light etched the eastern dunes, the towering ramparts of the Cradle of Sins stood silhouetted at last before them. Tasi fell to her knees in the sand, sobbing. The cursed fortress opened its gates to accept 2 more desperate souls into its abyssal depths. Chapter 10. The Oasis Mirage. Tasi could scarcely believe her eyes as dawn illuminated the fortress walls looming abruptly from the sands scarcely a mile ahead. After so many days and leagues enduring the unforgiving desert, the cradle appeared like a mirage conjured from her deepest yearnings. Part of her feared that if they drew too near, the walls and towers would dissolve like the other visions that had haunted their journey, revealing the refuge as illusion. But the structure remained solid and towering as they approached on weary legs across the dunes. Not a mirage then, but sanctuary at last. The last stretch of burning sand seemed to crawl by at a snail's pace. But step by agonizing step, the towering edifice grew before them, until its true scale became apparent in the rising light. The imposing ramparts stood nearly 40 feet tall, dominated by a gatehouse adorned with elaborate carvings long scoured by driving sand. Parapets atop the walls promised hidden archers who could rain death on any invaders below. And within lay the cluster of the fortress itself, turrets and domed roofs visible over the rim. To Tasi's bleary gaze, the size and grandeur rivaled any European castle constructed in those eras. What manner of people had raised this citadel in the heart of the wastes so long ago? Even without setting foot within, she sensed the cradle's history ran deep. The last distance broke her faltering spirit. They had survived the aircraft wreck, days without provisions, and endless leagues beneath the hostile sun. Yet now, with sanctuary within reach, her legs refused another step. Tasi sank to her knees a mere 100 yards from the dark gateway. Beside her, Salim collapsed into the sand, wheezing shallow, rattling breaths. This was their end, so close and yet out of reach. Hot tears streaked down Tasi's face, washing away some of the grime. Tasi's vision blurred, obscuring the fortress walls in a watery haze. All this way surviving the unforgiving desert, only to expire mere yards from potential salvation. It was too cruel, too unjust. She clenched her fists, anger breaking through the despair. No, she would not surrender to this wasteland without a fight. With a guttural cry, Tasi surged to her feet, fresh adrenaline flooding her veins. She hauled Salim's limp form up, draping his arm over her shoulders. He groaned faintly, but his legs would not hold him. Still, she would drag them both across the sands if she must. "I won't let it end here," she hissed between clenched teeth. One agonizing step after another, her boots sank into the dunes, her broken legs screaming in protest. She ignored it all, fixing the dark gateway with a smoldering glare. They would breach that portal or die trying. The walls inched closer, blurring in and out of focus through her sweat-stung eyes. The sand burned beneath her feet, radiating heat even in the early hour. She panted raggedly, throat raw, but did not slow. Only yards remained, then mere feet. With a final gasp, she breached the gateway's shadow and collapsed against the ancient wood and iron. They had reached the cradle. Against all odds, the fortress had welcomed 2 more lost souls into its time-worn depths. Tasi slumped there in the gateway dirt as her vision darkened. But she smiled in triumph, even as consciousness ebbed. The desert had failed to reclaim them. They yet lived. For now, it was enough. When her senses returned, Tasi found herself propped against a cool stone wall in the shade, a moist cloth draped on her head. She blinked groggily, trying to clear her haze. Beside her lay Salim, stripped to the waist with his wounds bandaged. Could they have been saved after all? "Welcome, friends." The voice was warm yet haunting, like the desert wind, echoing in a deep cavern. Tasi lifted her head to behold an apparition. A young Arab girl watched them solemnly, deep umber eyes peering from her veil-wrapped face. She appeared no more than 10 years old and wore the simple garb of a nomad child. But those dark, knowing eyes betrayed far greater age and wisdom. Tasi's breath caught. Was this child real or another vision come to torment them? The girl offered a battered cup, and Tasi smelled water. She gulped it down, desperately despite the specter's strangeness. When she had drunk her fill, the child collected the cup calmly. "I'm Tupai. The spirits told me you would come." She spoke with the lilting accent of the Bedouins. "We have awaited you for some time." Tasi opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. The girl nodded as if she had indeed spoken. "Rest now, you have far yet to travel." With that cryptic remark, she turned and vanished through a weathered door, leaving Tasi staring after her in bewilderment. Nothing made sense in this place. Ghosts, visions, and now a young girl who spoke like an elder. But Tasi lacked the strength to unravel more mysteries. For now they had shelter, and against all odds, they yet breathed. There would be time enough for answers soon, if they were meant to find them. Letting her head loll back against the sun-warmed stone, Tasi allowed exhaustion to reclaim her. They had survived the desert and breached the fortress walls. Whatever waited within remained beyond her power to reckon. At the precipice of oblivion, she surrendered unconditionally to the void. Questions could wait for another dawn. Chapter 11. It Towers in the Desert. When Tasi opened her eyes again, dusk shrouded the fortress interior. Weak light filtered through high arched windows, casting wavering shadows over the spacious chamber. She sat up slowly, her body stiff, but the worst pains faded to a dull ache. Someone had tended her injuries with care while she slept. Salim yet slumbered beside her, his breathing steady and color improved. She took his hand, heart swelling with gratitude that they had survived another day. Gently, she brushed hair from his face. His dark eyes fluttered open at her touch. "Tasi," he croaked. "The ghosts, did we make it?" She smiled softly. "Yes, my love. We reached the fortress. We are sheltered." He nodded before drifting back to sleep. Tasi pressed her lips to his bandaged brow. Despite lingering disorientation, their odds seemed brighter. Salim was healing, and they had found refuge from the merciless desert at last. She uttered another small prayer of thanks. Rising unsteadily, Tasi took stock of their surroundings. Motes of sand swirled in angled sunbeams, piercing the vacant room's gloom. It seemed a former guard chamber built of stone, some 20 feet across and mostly bare. Heavy timbered doors punctuated the walls, leading to other parts of the citadel. Tasi wondered again at their mysterious caretaker who had spirited them here. She stiffened as one of the doors creaked open. But it was only the young girl Tupai, bearing a clay pitcher and cups. Tasi hesitated, unsure whether to still trust the strange child. But her thirst won out. They drank together in silence until Tasi could stand it no longer. "Thank you for helping us, child," she began tentatively. "But where are your people who lives here now?" Tupai eyed her solemnly, as if weighing how much truth to impart. "Only you two live here now. The rest are gone." Tasi frowned. "What do you mean gone? You care for this entire fortress alone." Tupai nodded. "For some years now, since the purge." She recited this calmly, but sadness tinged her young voice. Before Tasi could inquire further, Tupai stood and clasped her hands. "Come, you should walk about a little to regain your strength. I will guide you." Though uneasy with more mysteries, Tasi agreed. They had to start rebuilding resilience. Leaving Salim to rest, she followed the girl through one of the timber doors and stopped short, amazed. They stood atop the parapets of an inner bailey, open to the darkening sky. Below spread the entirety of the fortress, its scale and complexity now visible. Rings of wall and towers enclosed a central keep, and various structures clustered between. Tasi raced from crenel to crenel, trying to take it all in. Aqueducts, barracks, stables, granaries, even lush gardens now turned to desert. The cradle had supported a sizable population once. Tupai watched Tasi explore with a hint of amusement. "Magnificent, yes," she asked proudly. "Many don't believe such a jewel could thrive in the wastes, but the ancients were wise." Tasi turned, brow furrowing. "It must take a great many people to maintain a fortress this size." The girl shrugged. "In the past, yes, but now just I remain. The rest," she trailed off, looking out at the twilit ruins. Unease stirred in Tasi again, but she let the matter rest for now. Together they walked the parapets and climbed narrow stairs to gaze at the central keep from above. Tasi's heart swelled, taking in the scope of this citadel snatched from the sands. Whatever tragedy had befallen here, the cradle's grandeur awed and inspired her. By the time Tupai guided her back downstairs, night had fully blanketed the fortress. Tasi bade the girl goodnight before returning to Salim, her spirit renewed. Tupai's mysteries lingered, but they would unravel them when strength permitted. For now, they had food, shelter, and time to mend. Settling beside her husband, Tasi brushed sand from his hair and bandages, considering all they had overcome. The desert's wrath, the crash, their frail bodies pushed to the limit, and yet against such odds, they had found their way here. To this profound, isolated oasis of stone and memory. Whatever salvation this fortress could offer, she trusted now they had at last found sanctuary. Escaping the wasteland was only the first trial. Greater tests lay ahead in the darkness of this haven, where loss and revelation awaited. But they would face the coming days together. And while breath and hope remained, she could ask no more than that. Chapter 12. The Threshold. Over the next few days, Tasi and Salam regained strength within the aged walls of the cradle. Under Tupai's diligent care, their wounds gradually healed and color returned to their cracked skin. When rested, they explored more of the crumbling citadel alongside the cryptic girl, who never offered details about the past or how she came here. Her secrets did not seem born of deceit, Tasi felt, but rather some old pain that left her reluctant to revisit history. Nonetheless, Tupai brightened walking the empty parapets and galleries with her new charges, often breaking her apathetic facade. She would grasp their hands excitedly when showing off some lost fountain court or tapestry fragment, smiling shyly like the young girl she appeared. In truth, Tasi mused, it was Tupai who cared for them more than the reverse. The child seemed so desperately lonely haunting this dead edifice alone. When she thought Tasi and Salim weren't looking, her youthful face betrayed profound sorrow. On impulse one day, Tasi hugged Tupai tightly. The girl's body tensed in surprise before relaxing into the embrace. By unspoken accord, they did not venture into certain portions of the citadel. The central keep, watchtowers, and subterranean levels remained forbidden. Tasi sensed dark currents in the air when gazing at those sealed doors, and Tupai refused to acknowledge anything existing within. Some festering horror dwelled in those depths, Tasi suspected. They were wise to avoid it. When not exploring, Tasi and Salim often sat in a ruined cloister garden near their quarters. The last clinging vines and trees had long succumbed to the encroaching desert. Yet even abandoned, the courtyard retained its tranquil magic. One afternoon, while resting there and watching sands swirl through the colonnade, Tasi turned to Salam. "I fear whatever calamity befell this place remains unfinished," she murmured. "Its wounds cannot fully heal while we refuse to know the past." Salam nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing. Since awakening, he often seemed lost in his own mind, another haunting Tasi wished desperately to exorcise. Later, as she prepared for bed, resolve formed within her. Come the morrow, she would coax Tupai into unlocking more doors and legends. Ignorance mingled with denial only bred fear. She had not breached this oasis to cower meekly in the present. They must confront the past if any future lay ahead. That night, Tasi dreamed of walking alone through the fortress halls at dusk, grainy air tinged red by the setting sun. She climbed the central keep's worn stairs, finding each door unlocked and open in invitation. Within lay only emptiness and questions. At the highest chamber, the last vestiges of light illuminated words carved into the far wall. "Turn back, cowards," the script read. "The wounds cannot be closed, only opened." Tasi spun as the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the crimson dark. She clawed frantically, but the sealed portal would not yield. As panic swelled, she heard the girl Tupai speak from the blackness. It was already written. The revelations await. Tasi woke just before dawn, heart racing. Dressing quickly in the gloom, she went to rouse Salam. It was time. They had lingered too long in the present. She knew now the doors must open, no matter how dire the cost. Together, they woke Tupai as the sun crested the horizon. The girl eyed them warily, life forms silhouetted in the doorway. She glanced between their resolute expressions and nodded once. So be it, the path was foretold. After a small breakfast, the girl led them on a new route. Tasi felt the air growing heavier, oppressive, as they descended cramped stairs to an iron-banded door. Tupai produced an ancient key and turned it slowly in the lock. The door creaked open. Tasi met Salim's eyes, seeing her own trepidation reflected. Hand in hand, they crossed the portal's threshold into the abyss beyond. The time had come to face the past. Chapter 13 is Signs of Sins. The chamber beyond the door yawned cold and cavernous. Tasi squinted in the gloom, details swimming out of the shadows. A faint spice scent clung to the stale air. As her vision adjusted, she made out rows of long wooden tables, dusty clay jars and baskets, a vast kitchen and larder. Once this space bustled with activity, preparing meals for the teeming populace above. Now only silence and memories remain. Tupai glided ahead into the shadows, without lighting any of the antique lamps. Tasi and Salim followed in uneasy silence, probing the dark with strained senses. Their footsteps echoed oddly, as if ghostly vestiges still hurried across the stone floors on some endless task. Passing the derelict kitchen, they entered a series of interconnected storerooms further buried in the earth. Crates and sacks slumped in corners, primitive writing on their sides faded beyond recognition. The deeper they delved, the colder the dry air became. The rooms and their forgotten contents felt more tomb than pantry. When Tasi could stand it no longer, she whispered urgently, "Tupai, please. What are we seeking in this crypt?" The girl paused, face unreadable in the gloom. "Signs." With that, she gestured to an open doorway yawning at the passage end. Beyond, Tasi glimpsed hints of space opening wider, and the dancing flickers of firelight. The girl glided wordlessly through the portal. After trading an uneasy glance, Tasi and Salim followed. The chamber beyond stunned Tasi to stillness. It was no storeroom, but rather a cavernous hall filled with rows of burning lamps reflected off dark water. A thick channel had been carved around the perimeter, turning the room into a macabre moat. What purpose could it have served? As she peered closer, Tasi glimpsed shapes moving beneath the rippled surface. She staggered back. Corpses. Dozens of them, preserved perfectly in the tannic waters. Men, women, even children, their skin cured to leather and faces contorted in agony. A few bobbed upright against the channel walls, dark mouths gaping in silent screams. The living tomb of an entire people. Horrified, Tasi turned to demand answers from Tupai. But the girl had vanished. Salim steadied Tasi as she choked back bile. "We should not have come," he murmured. But the gruesome tableau held them transfixed. What madness could have driven the ancient people to construct such a nightmare catacomb? Surely there had been no natural death here. Eyes watering from the lamp fumes, Tasi spotted steps leading down into the morbid channel. She had to understand. Leaving Salim murmuring prayers by the door, she descended the slick stairs into the waiting depths. The icy waters embraced her legs, soaking her garments and numbing her skin. Repressing a shudder, Tasi waited between the rank dead, peering into each face as if their clouded eyes might offer explanation. Marks of violence marred many, ragged slashes, clots of blood, charred and twisted flesh. Death had come brutally to this final generation. But why? What acts could warrant such an end? Tasi could almost hear the fortress itself whispering. A glint caught her eye through the gloom, the gold adorning the neck of one female corpse. Intricate jewels and discs etched with strange runes. Tasi reached out trembling fingers to grasp the talisman. A small hand seized her wrist, breaking the trance. Two Pai stood knee-deep beside her, eyes burning with warning. Silently, the girl took Tasi's arm and led her from that terrible hollow, back into the stale air of the tunnels where Salim awaited. Tasi glanced back once at the glowing tomb, still pulsing with questions. But Tu Pai pulled the door closed firmly, sealing the horrors away. All will be revealed soon. Tu Pai's voice echoed oddly in the gloom. For now, you know enough. They returned to the surface in numb silence to await the answers promised. But Tasi could not shake the feeling that she had merely glimpsed the surface of some profound darkness. Much remained submerged. Chapter 14, Whispers Below. Over the next few days, Tasi found herself lost in troubled reflection, struggling to reconcile the macabre revelations. She replayed each vivid detail, the countless preserved dead entombed below, their anguished expressions, the gilded amulet, grasping for some meaning amid the horror. But the truth lurked just beyond understanding, like words on the tip of the tongue. Tu Pai kept her distance after the unsettling descent, her mood haunted. She went about her work with eyes downcast, sometimes pausing to stare mournfully at nothing. Remnants of the trauma bled through her stoic facade. Tasi decided not to press the girl further. They had trespassed on hallowed ground better left undisturbed. Now they must wait for Tu Pai to share her truths willingly. To distract their uneasy minds, Salim led Tasi on aimless wanders through the abandoned wings of the cradle. Here places and objects evoked only mundanity, worn stone stairs trafficked by generations of footsteps, empty chambers that once held gatherings and meals, the ossified tree in the courtyard around which children likely once played. Faint echoes of life enduring, rather than the calamity that ended it. One day their roaming took them along the fortress's outer wall, overlooking the desert. The sands now swarmed gold in the midday heat. Tasi leaned against the parapet, gazing out at the undulating landscape that almost claimed them. From this vantage, the dunes appeared deceptively tranquil, the harshness temporarily masked. She wondered how many lost souls had stood here over the centuries, dreaming of escape from these walls. For good or ill, the desert could not be ignored, nor truly conquered. A light touch made her turn. Salim watched her with an unreadable expression, one hand resting on the weathered stone. Do you wish we had never come? His tone was somber. Tasi considered. I wish we had listened to our doubts, but I do not regret reaching this place, or surviving. Salim nodded slowly. Nor I, but I fear the wasteland is not done with us. He left the cryptic statement unexplained, returning his gaze to the vista beyond the walls. Tasi suppressed a shiver. She shared his unease. Whatever tragedy had broken the cradle still festered in these stones. And while they sheltered here, it seeped into their souls. That night, Tasi struggled to sleep, restless thoughts churning. When she finally slipped into dreams, she found herself standing atop the central keep beneath the stars, a cold wind keening. As she gazed over the shadowed fortress, anguished whispers reached her ears, soft yet multiplying. Cries and laments in a myriad tongues, lamenting sins of the past. Tasi peered down into the void beneath the parapet, seeking the source. There, in the abyss, pale spirits wandered screaming, reliving their pain. She reeled back, heart pounding. but invisible hands propelled her forward until she teetered over the brink. The voices surged louder, the dead outstretching their arms in summons. Tasi opened her mouth to scream, and awoke gasping, soaked in sweat. Just a nightmare. She rose shakily to calm her pounding heart. The dreams pressed against their minds now, sensing cracks in their armor, seeking to expose sins buried below. Tasi paced the chamber as Sullen slumbered on. There would be no further rest this night. She dreaded closing her eyes again, what visions might creep forth. Her musing halted as she glimpsed a light beneath the doorway. Stepping into the hall, she saw two Pai standing motionless, a torch burning in hand. The girl's face was grim. "You heard them?" Not a question. Tasi shuddered. "Yes, what are they?" Chu Pai beckoned her to follow. "The past, come, it is time." Together they descended through midnight shadows, lower into the earth. Tasi steeled herself against the whispers creeping from the stones. Chu Pai led fearlessly until an iron door opened on a narrow stairwell plunging steeply into darkness. Their descent began, the girl's torch casting writhing shadows. When they reached the last landing, Chu Pai met her eyes. "I guard the secrets, but you may glimpse if you dare." Tasi squared her shoulders and nodded. She would face whatever awaited below. The dead had called, and she must answer. Chu Pai unlocked a final door. Beyond lay the restless spirit's haunt. Tasi stepped through behind the girl and beheld her vision fully manifested. The writhing sea of specters, the source of the ceaseless whispers. There could be no retreat now. The horrors churning below had risen. She stood upon the precipice. "Behold the sins of our fathers." Chu Pai's voice echoed across the abyssal chamber. "Do not turn away." Tasi steeled herself and looked into the roiling darkness. She would bear witness. Chapter 15. A Creatures in the Shadows. The abyss echoed with the lamentations of spirits. Pale, emaciated forms wandered the endless darkness, wailing words in a myriad tongues. Many bore deep wounds still oozing spectral blood, or malformed limbs twisted in unnatural angles. They paid Tasi and Chu Pai no heed, locked eternally in their torment with sights unseeing. What trauma could imprison so many souls in this eternal night, that even death granted no escape? As Tasi's vision adjusted to the shadows, more details emerged from the writhing morass. Strange pendulous sacks hung everywhere amidst the ghosts, coated in viscous slime that reflected the torchlight. They seemed to pulse with malicious life, thriving off the ambient agony. Revulsion twisted Tasi's gut. This was no natural cavern. Some dark purpose stained the very walls. "What is this place?" she whispered. Chu Pai's face was carved from stone. "Where the sins of the past are born anew, where the dead feed life." Tasi opened her mouth to ask more, but the words froze on her tongue. Nearby ghosts had paused in their endless wandering, turning to face the intruders with empty gazes. Behind those hollow eyes lay cold rage burning across the centuries. The tortured spirits sensed the living in their midst. Tasi clutched Chu Pai's shoulder as the ghosts glided closer, their keening rising sharply. She discerned words within the eerie chorus of betrayers, trespassers, mortals. The girl stood firm, torch held aloft like a ward. Tasi fought the urge to flee. When the spirits had encircled them tightly, their cries ceased. The torchlight flickered wildly in an otherworldly wind. Then as one, the ghosts turned their backs and retracted into the gloom. But their whispered threats lingered. "We have seen enough for today." Tu Pai's quiet voice jarred Tasi from her paralysis. The girl led them calmly back through the maze of stairs and antechambers until they emerged gasping into the familiar upper halls. Weak dawn light illuminated the passage. Tasi slumped against the wall, trembling in body and soul. But Tu Pai regarded her solemnly. "Go rest now, and remember, the dead cannot harm the living. Only the living corrupt the dead." With those final enigmatic words, she vanished down the corridor, leaving Tasi to wrestle with all she had witnessed in the abyss. Ghosts were one matter, but whatever malign forces also dwelt down there were another breed entirely. She had witnessed only the outer layer concealing darker truths. They were meddling with powers beyond their ken. But the revelations had commenced and could not be halted. To learn the whole truth, she must peel back every layer of this shadowed sanctum, no matter how the lingering darkness tried to repel their intrusion. The fortress's secrets kept their own counsel and surrendered nothing freely. Great perils yet awaited any who dared plumb the citadel depths. But turn back she could not. Through blood or revelation, she would see their purpose here fulfilled. Until the very end. Chapter 16. A Horror's Revealed. Over the next week, Tasi wrestled endlessly with the abyssal revelations, their implications nagging like a shrouded threat. She replayed each detail, the mournful ghosts, the pulsating pods layered across every surface, and Tu Pai's cryptic assertion that the fortress dead somehow nourished new life. But its meaning eluded her. The girl had vanished following their ordeal below. Tasi desperately wished to talk through these troubling discoveries, but the child had withdrawn into her own haunted thoughts. Likely she too struggled to reconcile resurfacing memories thought safely buried. In her absence, Tasi explored the upper levels with Salom, seeking any clues to the cradle's past. Most chambers stood empty aside from drifts of sand and debris layered by years of neglect. Yet a few contained remnants not fully erased by time, cloth scraps, shards of pottery, faded markings on the walls. In one vacant guardroom, Tasi discovered etching on stone just visible in the torchlight. 16 Shawwal, 1201. Death cannot cleanse sins of life. He comes for us all. A cryptic fragment, but the first tangible link to this fortress's history. The Islamic date corresponded to year 1201 of that calendar, over 7 centuries past. Attempts to find similar carvings proved fruitless, leaving only questions. What tragedy did the unknown scribe allude to? What befell them in this desolate bolt hole? That evening, after a sparse meal, Tasi shared the carving and her theories with Salim on one of the meandering parapets. He stood motionless, gazing out at the last hints of dusk. The desert wind carried sand to sting their skin, reminding them of its timeless, implacable presence. No matter the secrets unearthed within these walls, the wasteland remained sovereign here. "I fear only the beginning of truth has been revealed," Salim finally said. "We breach ancient ground. There are protections on this place." He left her to ponder his warning, returning below as full darkness fell. The endless sky above teemed with stars that now seemed cold and menacing. Even nature guarded this tomb, unwilling to surrender its dead too freely. 2 mornings later, Tasi woke Tu Pai, shaking her urgently. Dawn's light had barely pierced the windows, but Tasi knew right away something was amiss. She raced after Tu Pai through the twisting passages, until they emerged atop the eastern parapets facing the desert. Cassie froze. There on the dunes, no more than a league away, a fresh wreckage spilled across the sands, the remains of a small aircraft, glinting sharply in the rising sun. Impossible to mistake it for anything but recent. Her pulse raced. Had more unlucky travelers met their end here? But how had she and Salim missed the signs of a crash during their trek? The implications unsettled her deeply. We should search for survivors. They may need our help. Tupai shook her head. The desert has already claimed them, but we need to see. Together they picked their way down cracked stairs and out through a small side portal. The heavy gates that once guarded entry now sagged in ruins, leaving the way open. Cassie glanced up at the parapets anxiously as they exited the protection of the walls. What other eyes watched from those ramparts now? The wind scoured them as they crossed the sands, forcing Tasi to squint against the stinging barrage. As they drew nearer, details of the wreck emerged through the haze. Cassie's heart sank. There could be no survivors of this catastrophe. The plane's front had accordioned back on impact like so much crumpled paper. Jagged metal and shattered cockpit glass littered the circumference where further debris had been flung out violently. And beneath one torn wing, half buried in the sand. "No," Cassie whimpered, breaking into a run. It was the pilot, his lifeless eyes glazed in permanent shock beneath the shattered goggles. His leather jacket and gloves were shredded, the exposed skin scoured off, as if flayed. She dropped to her knees and reached a trembling hand toward his ruined face. Tupai's sharp cry jarred her from the grim urge to touch him. Cassie froze, listening. There, a faint wet squelching, accompanied by an incongruous susurrus like sand draining through fingers. She peered into the shadowed fuselage, where the sounds echoed from deeper within. Tupai backed away, eyes flashing a warning. But morbid curiosity drew Tasi forward. The interior was a charnel scene. Blood and gore drenched every surface, the cockpit utterly pulped on impact. Yet the gruesome details fixed in Tasi's mind were not the lingering human remains. Rather, what lay among and within them, a brood of pale beasts feasting gluttonously on the mortal fare. Tasi staggered back, bile rising. Their writhing bodies, the gaping maws wet with blood. She fled blindly from the vessel, Tupai's warnings lost to her. All conscious thought had burned away, leaving only the nightmarish image seared into memory. The horrors once veiled in shadow had come fully to light, revealed by the indifferent sun they shunned. Within the cursed refuge, life yet endured, sating its hunger without mercy. And she knew then their true prison had been glimpsed. Chapter 17. A Glimpse of a Husband. Tasi tore away from the carnage without direction or reason, sand flying beneath her frantic feet. She did not stop until the fortress ramparts towered once more above. Only then did she collapse to her knees gagging, the image of those vile beasts relentless in her mind's eye. Tupai's alarmed queries barely registered through her choking panic. She tried to calm herself with deep, ragged breaths, pressing fists against her eyes as if to force out the visions. But the creatures remained seared into memory, violating all reason. When she could finally gasp out words, Tasi clutched Tupai's shoulders desperately. What were those monsters? Where did they come from? She had glimpsed the bizarre pods nurtured by the dead's pain, but she had never imagined such being could emerge. The girl met her gaze solemnly. The sins must take form to be purged. Only by assuming flesh can they be rendered finite and ended. It was the same opaque mysticism, offering no true insight. Tasi's shock curdled to anger. I tire of your secrecy and riddles. I must know what we witnessed. But Tu Pai's expression only saddened. Some truth you are not yet ready to bear, but soon. She drifted off before adding cryptically, the seeds have always lingered in fertile darkness. With that, she turned and vanished inside the gates, leaving Tasi trembling on her knees in the sand. Would she ever receive a straight answer in this cursed place? She yearned to flee into the wastes and never look back. But her husband and their guide both remained within these tainted walls, whatever other secrets festered below. She could not abandon them. Over the next few days, Tasi wrestled with quantifying what she had witnessed, to no avail. She scoured the upper fortress for clues, but found only maddening emptiness. Without Tu Pai's guidance, she dared not descend to the haunted vaults again. And Salim had withdrawn even further into himself, engaging little when she tried explaining their discovery. He seemed to be losing himself page by page, the disjointed sentences scribbled on fleeting impressions. She felt him slipping away by inches, too numbed by his own inner plight to fully engage hers. Their solidarity wavered, each alone in their own nightmare. When her isolation swelled unbearable, Tasi took again to roaming the lonely parapets under the burning sun, where heat and light washed away the shadows for brief hours. The wasteland's harsh clarity focused her tumultuous mind. She stood there one afternoon peering north, when a lonely specter breached the horizon. A figure approached from the shimmering sands, at first a mere speck, then sharpening into the silhouette of a man, cloak billowing behind his battered frame. Tasi's heart seized. The shape, the gait, it could only be Salim. But what madness had driven him into the wastes alone? She raced down the crumbling stairs two at a time, nearly twisting her weak ankle in her haste. The guards had sealed the outer gates, but a smaller side door remained usable. She would bring him back from this reckless sojourn if she must drag his body home. Tasi threw open the door and raised a hand to shade her eyes. But she froze mid-stride, breath catching in her throat. The figure drew closer, allowing his ravaged features to become visible beneath the hood's shadow. Seared flesh, glistening entrails, her mind recoiled from the reality. It was not Salim after all. It was some shambling husk that only aped the motions of life while hosting death within. The monsters had found a new vessel. Tasi slammed the gates just as the thing lurched into range, driven by malignant will. Its hollow eyes held only bottomless hunger. Her heart threatened to burst from terror and anguish. Was there no end to the nightmare birthed here? She fled into the depths, tears blurring her vision. Where was husband, her true husband? She had to find Salim and beg him to escape this haunted crypt before its madness likewise consumed him. Their time was swiftly fading. Chapter 18. The Tomb Below. That night Tasi searched every corner of the fortress for Salim, calling his name to the stones themselves. But only endless echo answered. As cold moonlight etched the abandoned halls, she was forced to confront the possibility he had willingly vanished into the wastes. Despite his frail condition, the desert yet called to him with overpowering voice. Its secrets held more sway than any entreaties of love or reason. Exhausted in body and spirit, Tasi finally retreated to the small chamber they had awoken in after first breaching the gates however long ago. She lay upon the straw mattress, every fiber of her being craving to surrender to oblivion's temptation. To sleep, perchance to dream herself away from this nightmare. But slumber only opened the door to fresh torments. Tasi found herself wandering alone through a series of dusty chambers carved into living stone beneath the earth. Guttering torches barely illuminated the cavern walls covered in elaborate friezes and glyphs, their meanings lost to time. The scent of burnt myrrh hung in the dead air. She felt she walked through the veins of some colossal beast entombed around her. At last the claustrophobic tunnels opened into a vast burial chamber, dominated by a stone sarcophagus carved with unsettling symbology. Tasi felt compelled toward that crypt, an unseen force pulling her step by step to the stairs, leading up to its sealed lid. She gasped in relief when a small hand grasped her own, breaking the trance. Two Pai stood beside her, eyes reflecting the torchlight. "You tread where the living are not meant to walk again, but you must see." Together they climbed the worn steps and stood before the final prison. The sarcophagus thrummed with latent menace, hinting at the darkness confined within. This was a boundary not meant to be crossed. But the girl nodded, holding Tasi's gaze. Gripping Tu Pai's hand like a lifeline, Tasi stepped forward and pushed against the massive stone lid. It grated slowly open, stone scraping stone. From within came no burst of moldering dust, but rather a foul, wet breath like a sigh of release. The lid fell back fully, exposing the coffin interior. Tasi swayed, clenching Tu Pai for support against the overpowering stench. She peered into the dank space and beheld not desiccated remains, but rather a young woman floating in brackish fluid, eyes closed as if in peaceful slumber. The corpse was strikingly preserved, clad in rich raiment and adorned with elaborate gold jewelry. But her beautiful face was frozen in a rictus of agony. What had tormented this poor soul even unto death? As Tasi watched in horror, the corpse's eyes suddenly snapped open, cloudy orbs fixing upon her. A voice echoed from everywhere at once, originating from the open tomb yet resonating through Tasi's mind. "Behold the vessel surrendered unto me. Behold the truth etched upon ancient bone." The voice rasped with primal hate. As it spoke, sigils on the sarcophagus lid began glowing ominously. Tasi stumbled back, clutching her head as images flooded her mind against her will. She witnessed the woman's life in reverse, the tragedy and death that brought her here, the joyful beginnings, finally depositing her as a crying babe in her mother's bloody arms. A lifetime forced into Tasi's mind in mere heartbeats. When her senses returned, she found herself collapsed on the burial chamber floor, Tu Pai cradling her head. The echoes of evil yet rang through the stones. Through veils of torment, Tasi finally understood part of the cradle's sinister past. This had been the tomb of Tu Pai herself, centuries ago. And somehow, the girl's innocent spirit remained trapped by the evil buried alongside her earthly flesh. "We must go quickly," Tu Pai urged, eyes wide with fear. She helped Tasi to unsteady feet, and together they fled the scene of primal violation. But the presence had marked them, the forgotten sins crawling up from their restless tomb. Tasi awoke screaming, drenched in sweat. The nightmare released its claws reluctantly. She glanced about the empty room desperately, tears coursing down her cheeks. Dawn's light peeked through the slats. She was alone. But she understood at last that Tu Pai's spirit and their fates remained bound to this deep place, its buried secrets from eras past. Whatever dwelt here with the preserved dead could escape only through the living. And it was so very hungry. She knew then the true malevolence that had corrupted the cradle in ancient days and continued to haunt it still. Their glimpses were no longer enough. She must rip away every last shroud, concealing the nameless evil dwelling below, if they hoped to end its grasp on the living. Throwing on her robes, Tasi marched through the fortress seeking Tupai. It was time for the whole truth. The horrors at the gate no longer terrified her. Their only salvation now lay in ripping open old wounds completely, whatever beast emerged from within. She would face the bloody revelations without fear, and may Allah have mercy on them all. Chapter 19. Evil Emerges. Tasi found Tupai waiting silently in the ruined cloister courtyard, garbed in a formal robe instead of her usual dress. Dawn light filtered down to framed her somber face in gold. Though the girl said nothing, her grave eyes mirrored the haunted visions beneath the fortress stones. At long last, the time had come for truth. Together they descended through the maze of lightless corridors and stairwells leading into the depths. As they drew nearer the spectral vault, Tasi felt the air growing colder, laced with the whispering laments of the souls condemned to this nightmare. She shivered, but did not slow. Her will remained fixed on their course. At the last iron door, Tupai paused, one small hand resting on the frigid metal. I guarded the forbidden history, but you have earned the right to know. Tasi met the girl's dark eyes and nodded. I am ready. Tupai drew a heavy breath, turned the key, and led them into the familiar haunt of spirits. The wraiths kept their distance now, watching the living trespassers with baleful eyes that spoke of damnation. But Tasi refused to cower before their wrath. She had come to finally pierce the veil on their torment. At the chamber's heart, they halted beside the open sarcophagus, its occupant still resting uneasily within the stagnant pool. The girl clasped Tasi's hand tightly, as if drawing strength for the words to come. In life I was but a lowly peasant girl who dreamed of more, she began, voice echoing across the vista of souls. I envied what I did not possess, and scorned the modest trappings fate bestowed. In my vanity, I did not see how darkness lay coiled around such thoughts, waiting for a vessel. She paused as if gathering herself before continuing. When I came of age, I was chosen to serve in the great fortress above, which some called the Cradle. I nurtured hopes of rising above my station, not realizing a far different destiny awaited. On my 16th passage around the sun, the high priest came to me. He said I had the mark, that a great honor waited. Tasi felt Tupai's hand tremble and grasped it tighter. Dread crept upon her as the tale unfolded. The priests took me to the caverns below, where the holy rituals were performed. They said I would become the bridge for a glorious being to enter our world. There beside the sacred pool, the ceremony commenced. The girl's voice broke. Tasi heard her breath coming faster. But it was no divine spirit they channeled into my flesh, but rather a force of ancient evil long buried in shadow. It violated me utterly, expunging all that I was to make room for itself. From that moment I was merely the shell through which it could feed and grow powerful once more. Tasi felt bile rise in her throat. The violations committed here had birthed a horror beyond comprehension. Tupai lifted her tormented eyes. For a year I dwelt in darkness, watching helpless as it twisted the cradle to its desires. The priests nurtured its evil above all else. Then, upon the anniversary of my conversion, they held the ceremony again. But this time with another innocent as vessel. Her gaze drifted to the sarcophagus. But the evil had grown too strong. As it tried inhabiting the new host, its power burst free, expunging all life from this place. What you see now are the hollow ruins left behind, emptied of all but pain. Tasi's voice rang hollow in the dead chamber. And your spirit has remained trapped here ever since. Tupai nodded, eyes full of centuries of sorrow. I cannot move on until the evil is fully banished back to the abyss that birthed it. But in your coming, I sense a chance. Her words ended abruptly as a violent tremor shook the buried hall. The ghosts shrieked in unison, recoiling as the sarcophagus lid burst apart, ancient seals shattered. From the cavity rose a swirling cloud of absolute darkness, boiling up to fill the cavern. A sound emanated from its depths, both deafening and silent. Tasi collapsed, clutching her head, all senses overwhelmed. Through the chaos, she heard Tupai cry out across the maelstrom. The bindings crumble, you must banish it. Only then can there be salvation. Blind and deaf, Tasi crawled through the roiling shadows towards the girl's voice. She had one chance to cease this cycle of violation. She would not fail now. Evil would no more claim Tupai's soul, nor turn her own light to darkness. With the last of her strength, Tasi rose on trembling legs, arms outstretched toward the ravening cloud. From the very depths of her spirit, she drew forth a defiant cry. Begone! Her voice rang with righteous fury, echoing through the abyssal vaults. The churning wickedness hesitated, wavering on the precipice between worlds. Tasi summoned every ounce of her will and screamed again into its maw. You shall claim no amori. With a rushing roar, the boiling entity collapsed inward, dragged howling down to the depths from whence it crawled. Blinding light filled the burial chamber, driving out the clinging shadows. When Tasi could see again, silence reignited. The sarcophagus stood empty and ruined, its occupant finally granted peace. Of the spirits, no trace lingered. And Tupai smiled, tears lining her vision. Salvation, she whispered before her form dissipated into dust, centuries of burden lifted. A peaceful silence slowly reclaimed the sacred chamber. Tasi fell to her knees, the ancient evil's roar still echoing in her mind. But she too felt a terrible weight lift from her soul. The cradle's long nightmare neared its end. They had come through fire and faced the darkest revelations. What future now awaited beyond this tomb, she did not know. But for this one precious moment, the light had returned. And she wept at its beauty. Chapter 20. Confronting Loss. The days and nights blurred as Tasi wandered the empty fortress in solitude. Since banishing the ancient evil, she had not seen Salim or Tupai's spirit again. Perhaps they too had been granted peace with the evil's dissolution. She prayed it was so, though her heart still clung desperately. During her aimless vigils, Tasi pondered the revelations unveiled below. The story of the cradle was a tragedy of arrogance and perversion, innocence exploited in the name of faith twisted foul. Her dear son had died from her own negligence, but dwelling on past sins would only breed further darkness. In banishing the evil entity, Tasi felt the stirrings of her own absolution. She had confronted loss and put grief in its proper place. The time had come to leave this haunted crypt behind. On the morning she prepared to depart into the desert, Tasi stood atop the central tower, taking in the entirety of the fortress one last time. From up here, its true scale and grandeur shone clear beneath the rising sun. The abysmal darkness was gone, leaving only weathered stone and memories of lives lived within these walls, both beautiful and tragic. Their spirits were free, lingering no longer. Turning east toward the open sands, Tasi breathed deep. The wasteland once more called to her with its timeless voice. But this time she answered without fear, ready to complete her long-delayed journey. She descended the stairs with purpose and strode through the imposing yet lifeless halls until hot sand greeted her boots. Pausing at the threshold, she whispered a small prayer. "Goodbye, old friend. Thank you for guiding us through darkness into light." With that, she stepped outside, leaving the cradle to its weathered repose. The desert wind whipped about her as she traced a meandering course north and east through the dunes. She walked steadily for hours, pausing only to sip water and eat dried fruit. The sun tracked its daily passage overhead, but she did not hurry, letting each step soak into memory. When dusk's long shadows stretched before her, Tasi crested a high dune and saw her destination at last. There in the distance, glinting faintly on the horizon, stood the remains of the crashed plane. She had spurned its nightmare revelations once. Now she approached with somber purpose, ready to make peace with ghosts. As she drew closer, however, Tasi saw with a start that the wreckage appeared subtly changed. The ruptured metal had faded, as if years old and half buried by drifting sand. No remnants of carnage lingered, only the silent tomb of a lost voyage. She moved reverently between the skeletal wings and cockpit fragments, saying prayers for the pilot and others whose lives ended here. They had found their rest. When the last glimmers of light faded from the sky, Tasi sat beside the ruined fuselage, gazing eastward where stars peeked between dunes. All was still save the soft sifting of sand. After untold empty stretches of time, her meditation was broken by faint sounds, the shuffle of boots, heavy breath exhaled through cloth. She turned and beheld two weary travelers crest the dunes supporting each other, heavy packs on their shoulders. Their eyes widened, reflecting the stars and moonlight. Tasi stood slowly. "Greetings, wayward souls. There is nothing to fear." The pair, a man and woman, stared in wonder. When they found their words, the man gestured to the wreckage behind Tasi. "Were you in this crash as well?" Tasi smiled softly. "In a manner of speaking, but do not fret. The trials here have passed. All ahead lies open to peace." At her gentle voice, the tension drained from the pair's bodies. They seemed to understand no threat lingered in this place any longer. Perhaps even glean the outlines of what she had overcome. Near dawn, the four travelers took refuge together in the ruins of the tiny outpost further north. As the man and woman slept, Tasi kept solemn watch outside and whispered prayers over the valley where hot wind keened endlessly through bone and stone. She thought of Tupai, Solomon, her son, hoping they had each found their own path through sorrow into the light, as she too now embodied. When the bold sun breached the horizon, she roused her new companions gently. After breaking their fast, together they ventured out into the open desert, the only direction that mattered anymore. They walked steadily beneath the blue veil of sky, four small souls together. Behind them, the cradle and its broken plane melted back into mirage and buried memory. Ahead, the sands beckoned endlessly. But Tasi walked without fear. For beyond the desert's harshness, far past the murky horizon, she knew gentler lands awaited. Lands where lost ones might someday reunite. Until then, her heart had faith. The deepest revelations were found not in static vaults, but on the pilgrim's road. And so she traveled on into the rising dawn. The end.